Thanks very much for the invitation. Just 2 years ago, I was talking about the same subject in Zagreb, in a far better political situation, I would say. And now I'm back again in ex-Yugoslavia, this time in Belgrade. But since 2 years ago, there were already signs of strategic problems arising, and now we have to discuss what came out of it. We shouldn't have to fool ourselves. This was a major defeat experienced by the Greek government in the face of the creditors. But it's not only Syriza that has failed by now. The whole left failed in Greece and in the rest of Europe. Europe is no longer what it was. It's impossible to defend this project of European unification from the left without falling into pure illusions. But then what? Ever since the last European parliamentary elections, the minimal demand was no further transfer of powers from the national to this European Union. This is certainly right, but then what? Some hope right now that they can score points with alternatives to the current European Union. But already before the crisis, there was the question, what's the concrete strategy we could use to carry out these alternatives? The social union was a model for some of us for more than 20 years, and it's turned into a complete illusion. The greater the defeat, the submission of the Greek government, you may say the more radical the left defiance becomes. Whether this means we support a left exit from the European Union or from the Euro or both, or a radical democratization or even socialist transformation of the European Union, or some kind of reformist unemployment insurance for everybody in Europe, things like that. None of this is realistic, none. None of this is connected to a strategy for how to get there. It's all politics that amounts to nothing more than proclamations and intellectual games, far from the seats of power. There's no subject for carrying it out. As a worldview for organizing and political orientation, these desperate attempts at self-assertion are good for not much or nothing. I, for one, am uncertain how do we go forward with a view for some kind of socialist transformation right now. We, especially in the German and the French left, haven't been able to do anything to shift the balance of power. Our solidarity with Greece was symbolically important, very important, but demonstrations for healthy food reached many more participants than demos for solidarity and against the German government's austerity politics. And now a debate has broken out whose decisive effect is felt not just in Greece. It is, so to speak, Schäuble's second victory, our finance minister in Germany. The left has been split. In Germany it's not so dramatic, but it's serious enough to distract us from our own problems and mistakes. In France, there's a real danger of a split in the face of an increasing radical right becoming more and more the major force in France, and the left is breaking apart. So maybe the first lesson to learn for all the countries from this situation is become more. What would be a strategic position, not only a programmatic one, with good ideas, or even better ideas, but a strategic position that would actually change the relations of forces. This puts the question of organization back on the agenda. And here there's a lot to learn from the post-2011 experiences in Greece and in Spain. Without solidarity, we haven't managed to make a difference because our numbers are too small. We have nowhere near enough anchoring among subaltern groups, and we have not developed anywhere near enough connective practices. This is, of course, also right for the left in Portugal, Ireland, Italy, or elsewhere. Here's where we could begin, with a strategy that is more strongly oriented towards intervention in concrete, everyday social relations through civil society organizing. And this was combined, in Greece and Spain at least, with building some kind of connective practices between the different movements, between parties, and building some kind of new platforms. Let's call it a change from the discursive, the arguments transmitted by programs and by media and things like that, to the material level, that is interventions in concrete social relations. This is how in Spain and Greece the base could be broadened far beyond the usual milieus of the left and the already active people. Their constituent parts are local units in which members do not just talk about politics like in a party often, but also take part in everyday practice, preventing forced evictions, organizing tenants, supporting labor struggles, doing refugee work, etc. This seems a banality, but it isn't. These are solidarity networks that in this way draw more people into political organizing. In this way, it was possible to also reach the precarious class sections, often of migrant background, that no longer expect anything from elections or democracy. What could be promising in the long term are also pilot projects for transformative organizing in so-called social flashpoints, so social areas of where a lot of problems come together, like the French banlieue, or even in Germany we had a lot of these areas. Solidarity practices in the middle and in the bottom of the society laid the basis for the success of Syriza, for instance, or for the Spanish municipal movements in Barcelona, Madrid, and a lot of other cities. Podemos still has its litmus test ahead of it, and it doesn't seem to go in the right direction. We can discuss this later. But to be able perhaps to fail like Syriza, we would first have to be successful as it was. We would have to come as far as it did. This perhaps is the first lesson to learn from the failure. And I will say successful failure has to be organized. Seems like a paradox, but it's extremely important for the history of the left. This also implies to those who see their politics as confirmed by Syriza's defeat, or as Stathis Kouvelakis, a proponent of the left Grexit and a former member of Syriza's party executive and leading member of the left platform that then split into the Unity Party. He calls, quotation, "Our position is the typical, I always said it from the beginning strategy. But if no motivating force can be developed out of this position for a Grexit, it means political failure. For it, we are powerless and have proven incapable of translating our position into a course of action for the masses. Then our position obviously has to be validated, newly validated." The discourse of none of it meant anything in the end was already dominant after the dying down of Occupy, of the Indignadas movement, and turned to be of little use, premature, and above all, wrong. Admittedly, the defeat this time is especially heavy, at least in the short history of the left since the beginning of the recent major crisis. But defeats were always also an important movement of reprisal, learning, and reorganization. Viewed in this way, failure has always been the left's most important form of motion. Quote, not exactly from Gramsci, but he means it in a way. Such learning effects, of course, are not automatic. In order for lost struggles not to lead to disorganization and splits in the left, there also has to be a kind of connective practice in evaluating and reorganizing, especially in the struggle that has not even ended, as it is the case in Greece and in the European austerity regime. A moment of catharsis, difficult word, if it is used as such. Reducing everything to the question of the Grexit or not is detrimental to such strategic reorientation. In what follows, there will therefore not be a good advice to the Greeks. I will only formulate some major lessons or problematics in general for future left projects. We should keep in mind that civil society solidarity structures and unifying practices were what made it possible for Syriza to come to power and for us to even argue about it right now. Maybe the second lesson, use the historical moment. We have repeatedly seen how important it is not to pause at the moment of an electoral victory. The enemy is weakened, and at the momentum of mobilization, it's still at its high point. The carrying out of decisive projects is more probable at this point as long as the political enemy has not yet recovered his strength, has not coordinated with others, and has not been able to develop a new strategy. A complete different example, Obama, who whatever his faults, and he's not a leftist, but he's still the first African-American president in the US, it's a good example, I think. After enormous mobilization, he was able to win amidst the most serious economic crisis since 1929. But instead of using the moment and curbing the power of Wall Street, taxing the rich, and carrying out a kind of public New Deal, he pursued the false idea of a balanced policy and negotiated for a long time with the Republicans until the Democratic Party lost its majority in the midterm elections. The rest is history. But Syriza, too, was unable to use the historical moment. Although before the elections, a clear immediate action program and a strategy for the first steps definitely had been drawn up. We had talked so much about it in the years before. Some of the people closest to Tsipras feared it would lead to failure. Against the ratified program, the decision was made without any further consultation within the party, to negotiate with the creditors without preconditions. Confrontation with the creditors, which perhaps would have created a better starting point, was to be avoided. The original plan was to declare insolvency right after taking office in order to make a new attempt at debt cancellation within the Eurozone. The insolvency was indeed real and not caused by Syriza. Declaring it unilaterally would have been a calculated breaking the rules, including the introduction of capital controls. Greece could have credibly said to the European public that the preceding corrupt governments and the Troika's policy had for years covered up, exacerbated and protracted the country's insolvency. Everyone who cared to know it knew that Greece had long been bankrupt, since years. The Troika and the European Cast still had not agreed on a strategy for dealing with the newly elected left government in this situation. There were many within the power bloc, not just the IMF, who had long thought that Greece was bankrupt and that the debts would have to be written off. Insolvency would have put the creditors under strong pressure to offer an immediate solution. Success would by no means have been certain, of course, but the moment fizzled out without being used. After months of the Greek government's desperate negotiations, defeat was palpable. In this moment of hardship, the referendum was a good chance movement for possibly coming out of the messy situation. The party rank and file and civil society organizations mobilized in a showing of remarkable strength for the Oshi vote against submission to a third memorandum. The referendum was supposed to improve the negotiating position. Some say it was done to have a failure and then go to the negotiations, but as far as I know, it wasn't. Whether the moment was consciously unused, or it came too late, or both, I don't know exactly. But on the other hand, what was successful to an extent was the notably rapid implementation of the measures to deal with the humanitarian crisis in Greece. Despite the lack of experience with the administrative apparatus, important measures were carried out in the areas of refugee policy, the reintroduction of some kind of minimum wage, of food stamps for the poorest, reconnection and free basic electricity provision, easements for over-indebtedness, reintroduction of basic pensions, reintroduction of unemployment and health insurance for low earners, recruiting of doctors and free access to health care, also for the non-insured, recognition of same-sex partnerships, and so on and so far. All this is in danger right now. Except for smaller reforms in the taxation of business and the slow-moving detection of tax evasion and money laundering, a direct attack on the Greek oligarchy and its corrupt connections within the state, the economy, and the media was avoided. A twofold strategy seemed too dangerous for the government. Still, perhaps it was exactly this what would have been necessary. The orientation of propaganda in the creditor states was that the corrupt classes of the super-rich in Greece should not be called on to help service the debt because it was the fault of the Greeks themselves, which is hypocrisy, but very effective. Could have, should have, would have. What can we learn from all this? To never engage the struggle below the level of the current relations of force and never let the brief moments of historical possibilities go by unused. A third lesson, another paradox. Civil society hegemony before taking office is not enough. From Gramsci we learn that there has to be a political hegemony already before taking office. And in exercising political leadership or hegemony, one ought not to count solely on the power and material strengths of the state it confers. This advice was heeded, in a way. Syriza's symbolized the point of condensation, translation, whatever, of civil society self-organization and protest into perspectives of institutional power. But it is also not enough to have one hegemony in the civil society before taking office. Government and civil society have to be rethought. 2 years ago here nearby in Zagreb, I said the following, which we discussed in the Syriza leadership very often. It was clear that the room for maneuver inside the given institutions was going to be more than extremely narrow. Neither the clutch of the Troika nor that of the international financial markets would be loosened, on the contrary, and we have seen it. A left government would be wedged between authoritarian European constitutionalism and a bureaucratic apparatus occupied by clientelistically PASOK and Nea Demokratia. It would also have to expect an economic crisis aggravated by measures taken on the capitalist side. All this happens. Rejected in renegotiation of the memorandums will not be enough. That was clear for everybody. At any rate, it was equally clear that Syriza had no choice. After the electoral victory, it would have been impossible not to take office, to leave it to the grand coalition of the corrupt system parties, that shared responsibility with the Troika for the country's catastrophic condition. Nevertheless, one should have been able to know, and many did, that the government's expectations of being able to govern in the usual way was not viable. The initially swiftly implemented humanitarian emergency program needed to be accompanied by a rupture or a break that would involve large parts of the population in a process of collective reorganization and refounding of democracy. That was discussed years before taking government. A true transformation cannot be a transformation via the state. We heard it in the first panel in a way. Or as Nikos Poulantzas said, a transformation of the state apparatus in the sense of a withering away of the state can only rest on an increased intervention of the masses in the state, certainly with the help of the trade unions and political representatives, but also through the unfolding of their own initiatives within the state, of people's own initiatives within the state. It will not be able to limit itself to a mere democratization of the state. This transformation must be accompanied by a development of new forms of direct grassroots democracy and spread networks and centers of self-governance and, Dario may say, self-production. Solidarity initiatives can be important points of departure for struggles around or for the welfare state. In these struggles, as organizational nodes, people's self-conception of what they can achieve can change, and it changed. These initiatives are therefore potentially not only an effective remedy against right-wing populism, like we've seen in Greece, but can also reduce dependency on a left government and prevent clientelism. They do not limit themselves to civic engagement that compensates for the thinning out of the welfare state in neoliberal terms, but aim those civil disobedience and direct appropriation and its reconstruction and democratic remodeling of parts of the state and taking it back into civil society. From this perspective, the expansion and democratization of the welfare state should redirect funds and decision-making power towards civil society. No one can be mobilized by asking 5 people to cross their fingers in negotiating with the Troika. Just as no one can be mobilized to exit the euro. For what? To concretely reclaim the state at the point where people experience it in their everyday lives, in healthcare, in education, in media, in workplaces, organizing the necessary financial means also. That is what could have mobilized and connect with an existing praxis. An example, the movement of solidarity clinics with their knowledge and engagement of doctors, healthcare workers, patients, relatives, and activists could have been a basis for a reform of the public healthcare system that aims at participation and transparency and opens up administrations to the masses, use their knowledge and anchors their power there. Some steps were taken in this direction by extremely carefully, I would say. Councils could have been formed everywhere, which could push forward the reconstruction of the state more powerfully than a single left minister at the head of an apparatus shot through with clientelism and corruption, especially in the tax administration. This twofold strategy of negotiations and rupture was not taken up. The wish was to avoid a war on 2 fronts and so not to risk a conflict with the Greek bourgeoisie within the country and with the European institutions. And so there was no turning to the very mobilization that could have bolstered the government, not only at the European level, but also in the struggle against corruption and tax evasion, for cutting the horrendous arms expenditures and the introduction of a wealth tax. These were precisely the points used by the anti-Greek propaganda in the creditor countries to continually accuse the government, the left government of course, which was incredibly hypocrisy, as we know, since the Troika itself prevented these measures from being taken. But there's still a widespread thinking of first we have protests, then we have movements, then we build a party, we win elections, and build a government to change things. Movement have its place, but this is very old stylish and a linear thinking. Taking government is the moment when you have to reinforce movements and self-organization, new connective practices between the different functions, and bring civil society back in the game. And not instead of thinking, now we're in a government and now we do things. This is also true for Podemos in a way. They have the same linear thinking that first there was this big mobilization, then we organized in the neighborhoods, and now we have a party, and then we take government, and then we vanish. Moreover, a mobilization of civil society could have also been an important corrective for the government. Every trade unionist knows how helpful such pressure can be for negotiations. Foregoing it tended to render civil society passive. Incidentally, the left platform also had no such strategy, and with its program focused on the Brexit, pursued a purely parliamentary and statist tactic. They seemed uninterested in mobilization. Panagiotis Satiris, an ex-Antasia member and member of the Popular Unity, sums up self-critically, "We acted like a variation of Syriza that credibly upheld its principles, but not as a new front that organically grew out of the movements and social conflicts. Our party did not succeed in opening itself to the experiences of the movements." Repeated mobilization, like for the elections, then for the referendum, then again for the elections, in individual cases without giving people a real voice, however, leads to a disillusion. Not only has the left platform split off, still more serious is the loss of the base, which is leaving the party in droves, with many of the most active liaison people in civil society and the movements among them. There is still not a break between all the movements in Syriza. Some broke up, others are still thinking and discussing what would be a right, consistent approach towards the Syriza government. There's a discussion of founding a new civil society organization, a kind of platform that would not exhaust itself working with the governments, but pursuing its own agenda of social organizing and social transformation. A platform able to either pressure on the government or support it, depending on the specific conditions and measures that would be taken. Syriza and Tsipras won a second mandate, but they have to learn from their and our own mistakes. It will not be enough to socially cushion the memorandum measures. But at the moment, it's a very difficult situation between the government, the party, and the movement. Maybe the fourth lesson in this context, the autonomy of the party from the government and the parliament. Syriza has undertaken far-reaching changes in the political structure of its own organization and developed close institutional, indeed organic ties with the movements, far more than any other party in Europe as I know, except very smaller ones, like the Coup. Together with the movements, it founded Solidarity for All network in order to network and strengthen the structures of solidarity countrywide. Every deputy gives a significant part of his or her salary to Solidarity for All. At least one of each deputy's staff is made available for the work exclusively in the movements, etc. And so there were very good connections with the movements. However, there was a little ability to guarantee a positive path from impulses from the movements into the party. There was a good connection from the party to the movements, but not back from the movements to the party. Furthermore, from the very start, Syriza was threatened by the danger of being completely absorbed by government duties. As Elena Papadopoulou puts it, who is now secretary in the finance ministry, coming from the movement. Situations are repeatedly arising in which party cadre are absorbed into the state apparatus and the left party only still exists as a government party or as a parliamentary party, which describes Syriza with some exceptions. Against this, Papadopoulou recommends it is necessary to hold on to our own presence in the social field and even to expand it. Yes, but they didn't. The party was marginalized in relation to the government and the parliament. It no longer played an independent role. It's a classical mistake. The German left had done it in regional governments a lot of times, but also everywhere else. This is a classical mistake. Along with this, those who had been important in organizing the close connection between the party and the movements, who had built vital relationships in civil society and were precisely for the twofold strategy of negotiations with the creditors and rupture in the sense of mobilization within the country, were grounded down or made invisible between the clash of the government and its negotiating strategy on the one side and the left platform with its never developed exit option on the other side. Among other groups, I'm thinking here of the 53+ movement, a group within Syriza that advocates Syriza's cohesion, its democratic functioning, and its radical left movement-oriented direction. Central figures such as party secretary Tassis Kovanakis or Christos Giovanopoulos, the coordinator of Solidarity for All, have all left the party. For the sake of the future, left projects would have to ask, how can a relation of those in government or the parliamentary group and the party be shaped so that the necessary emerging contradictions can be cooperatively worked through? How can one guarantee that the party is neither subordinated to the government nor pitted against it? How are conflicts to be managed and democratic inter-party decisions made and opened up to civil society? To develop a connective praxis to cross the fault lines within the party and the social left should be a task of all parts of the left, but at minimum of the leadership groups and not of the liaison people very close connected to the movements. And then they build the connections to the movements and the government makes different things. That doesn't work, this kind of division of labor. So what does that defeat mean now for us in Europe? It was more than clear and repeatedly said, also by Tsipras, that one country alone actually cannot carry it off. They tried the impossible, they bought time, and politicized the question of democracy in Europe. But what does this mean for us? As I said, we haven't made a difference. The left parties and movements, intellectuals and trade unions in Europe, which altogether is not all that little, have at no point managed to create a common initiative in order, beyond all trench warfare, to come nearer to the shared goal of the end to austerity and of Europe's authoritarian neoliberal regime. As a burning glass, Greece and the politics of all the left in the major countries like Germany, but I think in most of the countries, at least in the European Union, show that the form of politics that we have pursued, whether movements, trade unions, or party politics, are not good enough. Therefore, what we need is a different strategy of organizing and becoming more, as I said before, based on organizing in the everyday struggles in the neighborhoods, bringing more people to taking their own things into their own hands. Even if we in Germany do not have a dynamic like that of Greece or Spain, and in many other countries too. What needs to be done now is to develop capacities, prepare things, reinforce organizing processes, in order both to be effective, despite the lack of dynamic, and to be prepared for a coming dynamic. To be active within a fundamental temporal discontinuity means, on the one hand, to gather forces and develop, and on the other, to open up for the unforeseen. This means an attitude that is really to grasp the opportunity to intervene in those temporary openings that allow a leap forward and the creation of more favorable relations of force. Of course, alongside this priority of popular anchoring in solidarity praxis, there also needs to be a programmatic position and discursive strategies that can convey the connection of these everyday hardships to the European crisis. A left populism, so to say, or a combination of these popular strategy of rooting in the neighborhoods with a kind of populism that clearly names the perpetrator and addresses the anxiety in face of the feeling of external threat. From Greece, for the Germans, the Greece example, or the Spanish also, the Greece example is a dangerous one, or the Euro crisis, the Ukraine conflict, the refugees, surveillance and the NSA, terrorism. That is predominantly related to the situation in these countries and coupled to it, to solidarity praxis. Otherwise, we leave this anxiety, this fear to the right-wing populism and the extreme right. The fifth lesson may be building a common Oshi camp in Europe. Europe no longer represents hope. In fact, we should consider whether certain powers ought to be transferred back from the European to other levels. This would involve a new connection of decentralism with transnational mediations. In terms of municipal concerns, it is at this level that decisions should be made on what has effects beyond one municipality and region should be decided on higher levels, on a super-regional or national basis, with the participation of those affected. And of course, there are questions that can only be approached on a European level. Which matters these should be would be clarified within a constitutive process aimed at fundamentally refounding the European project. In this way, the impulse towards renationalization could be, maybe, remodeled into an impulse towards decentralization and Europeanization at the same time. For a broad political debate on the prospects, European-wide assemblies should be called a constituent process of consultation and organizing of a European civil society. It should not involve an abstract Europe discourse, but would be closely to the everyday worries and desires of people. This might be a perspective, but how to get there? With this aim, Varoufakis is proposing the founding of a new European platform. It's not very clear what it should be, but at least he has some kind of idea from building platforms, maybe like in Spain, or does he mean a party? We don't know it. We're talking with him. The initiatives around the so-called Plan B, Mélenchon, Lafontaine and others, are also pursuing a discussion of the new orientation of the process of European integration, and not just about a debate about left axis. That's always how that's the main point, but it's not their only point. Instead, movements are focusing on diverse processes of intervention in concrete everyday organizing, in connection with transnational assemblies and civil disobedience. But they are still going through a process of strategic clarification. Those forces that can be called movements of a new municipalism have a somewhat different strategy focus. They assume that far-reaching attempts at European organizing are hopeless if not based on the organizing within the everyday life of individuals in the neighborhoods, at the workplace, and in the municipalities. Within the Spanish state, connective platforms were able to win majorities in most of the country's large cities. Not only in Barcelona and Madrid, can the new left municipal governments name the major. In the US, too, various successes after the defeat of the Occupy movement can mostly be seen at the local and municipal level, for instance, around the minimum wage. In Italy, there is a long tradition of social centers as places of organizing. The municipality needs to be won back as a locus of politics, of self-organizing and participation. With Syriza, we have seen the limits of left governments come up against an authoritarian Europe. And this is, of course, also true in another way for a new municipalism. This also involves jumping scale to translate and connect such politics and organizing with a European level, for a network of cities and regions, or more emphatically, the perspective of a European commune as a constitutive process for another Europe from below. We have also seen the European campaigns can serve as an establishment of a new political space from below. Now there have been several campaigns on water, on ACTA, on seaports, on TTIP and others. The start of a mutual European understanding from below could be an organizing campaign for European citizens' initiatives that would name maybe 3 still to be defined central goals. Perhaps an end of social cuts and privatization, a European debt conference, taxing the rich with a European property levy, investments in a European-wide social infrastructure, healthcare, education, housing, and so on, and a solidarity refugee policy. It can be formulated better, more concretely, not more than 3 or 4 points. That European campaigns can be successful has recently been shown by the anti-TTIP campaign. But this new campaign should be more sophisticated, and it's far harder. Anti-democratic hegemonism of the European and especially the German government, the subjection and impoverishment of the Greek also find its critics even in Germany among relative minority of 20 to 30% up to now within the left liberal, green and bourgeois central spectrum. The refugee drama is considerably aggravating this antipathy. More than ever, we need to go beyond the current limits of protest and create a social bloc that says "Oshi" to the social cuts and destruction of democracy in Europe that goes beyond the classical left milieu. In the rest of Europe, resentment, especially of the German government, has grown enormously. It would not hurt if left parties, social movements, and critical trade unionists could unite Europe-wide around a few minimal demands in order to get such a campaign started. The European institutions would certainly reject an European citizens' initiative. That's good. As it is the case with TTIP, this could be a mobilizing effect, if you will, for a bold referendum for Europe from below, as the beginning of the self-empowerment of the constituent process, combined with activities of civil disobedience, social unrest, and more institutional activities also. These and other strategies are going to be discussed at a European strategy conference organized also by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in spring 2016, together with the most diverse social initiatives, groups, tendencies, and organizations. Along with the political contents, the alternatives we have, the conference will also deal with what is the right political form and how could we link the different political forms, because we don't unify in one political form. It's not the party, not the movement, not the government, but we have to see how we have some kind of very contested but connected practice, as well as a strategy connecting the most diverse levels from the local, municipal, national to the European level. because we have scarce resources. There is a reason why the Spanish and the Greek are not organizing on a transnational level in the first place. There's a reason why in Germany, for instance, we organize mostly on a transnational level, because we are weak on a local level. In each case, we have to debate where is the right place of the priority for organizing and how to connect it to the different levels. The aim, despite very different positions, very different goals, and we have very different analyses of what's happening. We don't have the same goals. Some are socialists, some want a kind of anarchist self-organization, some are mere social democrats, good social democrats, let's say, and so on. But we have to find a connective perspective in praxis to make things possible, not in a unified modus operandi, but at least a synchronization of our politics of resistance for another Europe. This time together, as a mosaic, not as a fragmented left, we acted in the last time, ready for the next defeat in the face of an ongoing increase of the radical right and the authoritarian neoliberal politics ruling right now with a state of exception. But we have to remember that we are experiencing a great crisis that things can change rapidly in every direction. Maybe we can do something that we are prepared if it moves into our direction. Thank you.